My wife, Karen, told me she was spending the weekend with friends. Turns out her friends had a name: Greg. But she certainly didn't anticipate what I had in store for her upon her return. When you're with someone for a decade, you tend to believe you know them inside and out. You persuade yourself there are no surprises left, that you've witnessed the worst and still chosen to remain. Karen and I were no exception. 10 years together, and we had our routine down pat. She worked in accounting. I managed a tech startup perpetually on the verge of collapse. It wasn't glamorous, but it functioned, or so I believed. The initial hint surfaced a few weeks prior when Karen casually mentioned a weekend getaway with friends. It was one of those offhand remarks that wouldn't typically register unless you had reason to scrutinize it later. "Just a girl's trip," she'd said, her tone a touch too nonchalant, as though rehearsed. I should have been suspicious, but I wasn't. I even assisted with her packing. That's how oblivious I was. Friday morning arrived, and she departed. I waved goodbye from the porch, observing her car vanish down the street. For the first time in ages, I had the house to myself. I should have felt a sense of relief. Time alone, no one reminding me about my shoes in the hallway or the dishes piled in the sink. Instead, a peculiar emptiness lingered, an unnatural silence. I disregarded it, immersing myself in work, burning the midnight oil-tweaking code that didn't require it, hoping the busyness would stifle the nagging feeling within. Yet, amidst the distractions, a persistent unease tugged at my subconscious. Call it intuition, call it paranoia. I picked up my phone and scrolled through Karen's Instagram, seeking anything out of place. Nothing. Just the usual images with her friends. Brunch spreads, picturesque sunsets, wine glasses clinking. Nothing unusual except for one small detail. No one had tagged her. By Saturday afternoon, I was weary of the charade. I settled at the kitchen table with my laptop, again attempting to lose myself in work. Instead, I found myself accessing her email account. I knew her password. Don't ask why. Perhaps it was trust. Perhaps it was her carelessness. But I had access. And there it was. A confirmation email for a cabin rental, addressed to her from a certain Greg. I confess, I fixated on the screen for a full minute, absorbing the information, wishing I was mistaken, hoping it was a misunderstanding or a joke. It wasn't. The reservation was for two, and Greg wasn't a name that instilled confidence in a marriage. My hands acted before my brain, navigating to Greg's Facebook profile. His page was public, a significant error on his part. That's when the realization hit me. She wasn't simply cheating. She was cheating with a man who had a fiancé. Her girls' weekend was an affair with some corporate type likely believing this was his walk on the wild side. You'd imagine that upon uncovering your wife's infidelity, the immediate response would be fury. Oddly, I didn't feel enraged. If anything, I experienced a strange tranquility, the kind that washes over you when you realize you're liberated from something unknowingly suffocating you. So, I reacted as any self-respecting husband would. I allowed her to enjoy her weekend. She was playing her game. I had time to devise mine. I devoted the remaining Saturday to formulating a plan, something to restore a measure of control. By Sunday morning, I knew precisely what I would do. She returned late Sunday evening. The jingle of her keys in the lock preceded her entrance. "Hey!" she called out, feigning casualness. I detected the nervousness in her voice. "Hey!" I responded, not glancing up from my phone, pretending absorption in something trivial. "How was the trip?" "It was good. Nice to get away," she replied. She lingered in the doorway, coat still on, observing me. I could sense her scrutinizing my reaction, trying to discern if I knew anything. "Oh yeah? Do anything fun?" A pause. I heard her swallow. "Not really. Just hung out at the cabin, relaxed, girl stuff." I murmured, continuing to scroll. I didn't look up, letting the silence stretch between us. "By the way, who's Greg?" I didn't need to see her expression to know the blow had landed. The atmosphere shifted. Her entire body stiffened in the doorway. A beat of silence hung in the air, long enough for me to relish. What do you mean, Greg?" You know, the guy you rented a cabin with. I finally lowered my phone, meeting her gaze. She was pale, ghostly pale, the kind of pallor that only arises when you've been caught red-handed and know there's no escape. I don't know what you're talking about, she stammered, attempting to regain composure, but the panic in her voice betrayed her. I leaned back, observing her squirm. Karen, stop. I know everything. I know about the cabin. I know about Greg. And I know about the emails, so let's skip the lies, okay? She stood frozen, uncertain how to proceed. I almost pitied her. Almost. Her mouth opened and closed repeatedly, as if searching for the right words, but nothing emerged. So I continued, my tone calm, almost indifferent. The thing is, I don't care anymore. You've been checked out for a while, haven't you? That caught her attention. She blinked, startled by my composure, my apparent lack of emotion. Tom, No, I interrupted, rising and grabbing my jacket. You don't get to explain. I've got my own plans tonight. I paused at the door, looking back at her. By the way, you might want to call Emily. She's been avoiding you for a reason. With that, I walked out, leaving her standing amidst the ruins of her perfect little lie. I didn't make a grand, dramatic exit. I simply retrieved my jacket, stepped outside, and inhaled deeply. It felt like escaping a burning building, though the fire hadn't entirely subsided. It still smoldered, poised to reignite. I wasn't sure where I was going, but I couldn't remain in that house with Karen, pretending normalcy. I ended up at a bar down the street, a dive where no one asks questions, and the only thing stronger than the beer is the cigarette smoke. I hadn't been there in months, but it was the ideal refuge for someone needing to vanish for a while. I ordered a drink, settled in the back, and attempted to make sense of what had just transpired. I thought about Greg, the cabin, the emails. It all felt so predictable, as though Karen wasn't even attempting to conceal it anymore. My phone buzzed as I finished my second drink. It was Emily. I could practically hear her voice, that careful, almost hesitant tone she adopted when uncertain of my reaction. Hey, she said when I answered. Hey, I replied, my voice rougher than intended. A pause. I heard from Karen. She's upset. I'm sure she is, I said, not particularly concerned. It was inevitable. Another pause. She hesitated, but I knew what was coming. We both did. So, what now? I gazed at my drink, swirling the amber liquid as though it held some answer. What now? That was the million-dollar question, wasn't it? I hadn't thought beyond confronting Karen. I hadn't even determined what I desired. All I knew was that everything had changed. I don't know, I finally admitted, but I'm not going back there tonight. Emily's voice softened. You could come over. We can talk. We both understood what talk meant. It was a euphemism for what we were unwilling to acknowledge. But at that point, it didn't matter. Nothing mattered anymore, not the way it used to. Yeah, I said, more to myself than to her. I'll come over. Emily's apartment was small but cozy. I'd been there before, for family dinners or when Karen asked me to drop something off. It had always felt innocent then. Now, crossing that threshold felt like traversing a line I couldn't retrace. She sat on the sofa, legs tucked beneath her, appearing as conflicted as I felt. I saw it in her eyes. The same uncertainty, the same guilty desire. The air between us was thick with unspoken words, but neither of us attempted to break the silence. I didn't think it would happen like this, she finally said quietly, shattering the tension. Neither did I. She let out a small, humorless laugh, shaking her head. I always thought you and Karen were solid. Yeah, I said, a bitter smile tugging at my lips. So did I. Another pause. That heavy, uncomfortable silence that descends when you're on the precipice of something irreversible. We both knew what was about to happen, but neither wanted to initiate it. Then suddenly, it didn't matter anymore. I crossed the room in 2 strides, and before I could stop myself, my lips were on hers. It wasn't gentle. There was no pretense of tenderness. It was raw, desperate, as if we were both trying to drown out the noise of everything that had led us here. I felt her heartbeat accelerate beneath my touch, her hands gripping my shirt, pulling me closer as though she needed the contact for stability. Her skin was warm against mine, the room fading as we lost ourselves in the moment. There was a recklessness to our kiss, as if we both recognized the wrongness, yet couldn't bring ourselves to stop. When her fingers grazed the back of my neck, just beneath my collar, I felt that familiar jolt of electricity, the kind that signals you've crossed a line. She pulled back slightly, just enough to meet my gaze. Her breath came in quick gasps. I saw the conflict in her eyes, the battle between guilt and desire. But neither of us spoke. Words would only complicate matters. Instead, we let the silence speak, our hands and lips conveying what we lacked the courage to articulate. I felt her nails graze my shoulders, the soft, almost hesitant tug at my shirt as though waiting for me to stop her. But I didn't. Neither of us did. The next thing I knew, we were entangled on the sofa, her body pressed against mine, every breath shared. There was something about the way she moved, the quiet intensity, that made me momentarily forget everything else, the betrayal, the lies, the mess we were creating. None of it mattered in that moment. It was just us, two people seeking escape from lives we'd somehow lost control of. I awoke in her bed the next morning. The sunlight streaming through the curtains was too bright, too unforgiving for what we'd done. I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing, attempting to reconstruct how we'd ended up here. Emily slept beside me, her breathing soft and steady, one arm draped over her pillow as though unconsciously reaching for something in the night. I remained motionless, knowing that the moment I left that bed, I'd have to confront reality. And reality was a mess I wasn't prepared to clean up yet. Eventually, Emily stirred. She opened her eyes slowly, blinking in the harsh light. When she saw me, her expression softened, but then the same conflicted look flickered across her features. The one that said we shouldn't have done this. The one that said, "What now?" "Hey," she whispered. "Hey." We lay there for a moment, neither of us wanting to address what we'd done, what we couldn't undo. "You okay?" she asked after a while, her voice tentative. "I don't know." And I didn't. I wasn't angry, not at her, but the weight of everything was beginning to sink in. "What about you?" She shrugged, looking at the sheets. "It feels complicated." "Yeah," I agreed. "That's one way to put it." The weight of the past 24 hours pressed down on us both. For a moment, I wished I could rewind, return to when things were simpler. But that was impossible now. We remained like that for a while longer, simply lying there in silence, both pretending the world outside wasn't waiting to crash down on us. Because we both knew that when it did, nothing would ever be the same. When reality comes crashing down, it doesn't wait for an invitation. It storms in, kicks down the door, and makes itself at home. That's how it felt sitting in Emily's apartment the following morning. The sunlight seeping through the curtains was too harsh, too revealing, as if it wanted to expose every misstep we'd made. But I didn't flinch. I wasn't going to. I had no room for guilt anymore. Emily sat beside me, wrapped in her robe, still processing what had happened. Her silence was heavy with unspoken questions, but neither of us had spoken yet. I knew she was waiting for me to say something, to explain, to clarify what this meant for us, for her, for Karen. But what could I say? We'd crossed a line, and there was no pretending otherwise. She finally glanced at me, breaking the quiet. "What happens now, Tom? What are we supposed to do?" I took a deep breath, not inclined to sugarcoat anything. We did what we did. There's no taking it back. But if you're asking if I regret it, I don't. Her eyes widened, perhaps anticipating hesitation or an apology. But I wasn't about to apologize for what was ultimately inevitable. "You don't?" "No," I said simply. "Do you?" Emily hesitated, biting her lip, still trying to make sense of it all. But I saw it in her eyes. Regret wasn't what she felt. Perhaps guilt, perhaps fear, but not regret. We both wanted this, whether we admitted it aloud or not. Before she could respond, a knock echoed at the door. Her entire body tensed. We exchanged a quick glance, but I already knew who it was. I could feel it. Call it bad timing or call it karma, but the universe wasn't about to grant us a reprieve. Emily rose slowly, her fingers trembling slightly as she reached for the door. "Who is it?" she called out, attempting to sound casual, but her voice betrayed her. "Emily, it's me. Karen." Her voice was calm. Too calm. That sharp, dangerous calm people adopt when they already know the answer to their question. I stood up, a half-smile forming. Of course it was Karen. She wasn't stupid. After all, she'd concealed her affair with Greg for months without a hitch. She knew how the game worked. Emily opened the door a crack, trying to shield the room from Karen's view, but Karen pushed it open further, her eyes darting around the apartment until they settled on me. Her face hardened, but she didn't look surprised. If anything, she looked expectant. "Tom," she said, entering without invitation. "What the hell are you doing here?" I didn't bother hiding it. I didn't owe her an explanation, not anymore. "What do you think I'm doing here?" Her eyes narrowed, flicking between me and Emily. "So, this is what it's come to, huh? Sleeping with my sister?" I saw Emily flinch, guilt flashing across her face, but I remained calm, almost amused by the situation. Karen standing there, acting like the victim, as if she hadn't just spent her weekend in a cabin with Greg. "You're not in a position to be outraged, Karen," I said, my voice cold and steady. "You've been screwing Greg behind my back for months. Did you really think I wouldn't find out?" Her eyes widened for a split second, caught off guard. That was the moment I'd been waiting for, the crack in her facade. But she recovered quickly, crossing her arms, trying to regain control. "Oh, so this is revenge," she spat, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You screw my sister because you found out about Greg. Real mature, Tom." I shrugged, unfazed by her attempt to shift the blame. "Call it what you want, revenge, closure. It doesn't matter. The point is, you don't get to play the victim here, Karen." Karen's face flushed with anger, but there was something else in her eyes. Fear. She wasn't accustomed to me standing my ground, to me turning the tables. She had always been the one in control, the one dictating the rules. But now, she was the one caught off guard. "You think this fixes anything?" she hissed, stepping closer, her voice low and dangerous. "You think screwing Emily makes you better than me?" I met her gaze, calm and unbothered. "No, Karen. It just makes us even." A heavy silence descended, the kind that arrives when everyone realizes the game is over. Karen's face was hard, her jaw clenched, but she remained silent. She knew I was right. There was no moral high ground left for either of us. We'd both been playing dirty. "So what now?" she finally asked, her voice quieter, as if seeking some semblance of control amidst the chaos. "I don't know about you," I said, moving towards the door. "But I'm done with this. With you. We're finished, Karen. We've been finished for a while." Her face barely registered shock. I wasn't the husband she thought she had. A fool waiting for her confession. No, I had my own plans now. I had the upper hand, and I intended to keep it. "You're really walking away?" she asked, her voice rising, anger flaring again. "Yeah," I said simply, opening the door. "I am. And don't bother running back to Greg either. He's got a wedding to plan." That last jab hit her hard. I watched her face contort, caught between disbelief and rage. But she didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. I'd already checked out. As I turned to leave, I glanced at Emily, who still stood by the sofa, looking as lost as I'd ever seen her. She opened her mouth to speak, but I shook my head. "We'll talk later," I said quietly, and she nodded, understanding that now wasn't the time for her involvement. I walked out of the apartment without looking back. The sunlight felt different outside, cleaner, sharper, as if I'd just severed ties with the weight that had been dragging me down for months. I didn't feel regret. If anything, I felt lighter. For the first time in a long time, I was free. Walking out of Emily's apartment felt like a decade's worth of weight had finally been lifted. The sun was bright, too cheerful for what had transpired, but I didn't care. Karen was history, and I wasn't wasting any more energy on her or the mess she'd created. I didn't return to the house. There was no point in confronting her again. I booked a nearby hotel, a place to think, regroup, and envision my life without the lie we'd both been living. The room was small and anonymous, perfect. No memories, no attachments, just a quiet space to process everything. My phone buzzed. It was Emily. "Are you okay?" I stared at the screen, wondering how to respond. I could have offered some comforting platitude, but the truth was simpler. I'm fine. I didn't owe Emily anything beyond that. What happened between us wasn't the start of something new. It was a consequence. Karen had her affair, and I'd had mine. We were even now. Clean break. No promises, no lingering guilt. Just reality. Later, another text arrived, this time from Karen. "Can we talk?" I almost laughed. There was nothing left to say. She cheated, I caught her, and I made sure she knew I wasn't going to passively accept it. Did she really expect me to return? Beg for a conversation? Pretend there was something to salvage? I left her message unanswered. Instead, I stepped outside, took a walk, and let the night air clear my head. No regrets, no looking back. For once, I felt free from the burden of pretending we were something we weren't. The next morning, I called a lawyer. No drama, no theatrics, just a clean split. We both moved on, and there was no need to prolong it. Afterwards, I returned to the house, not to talk, but to pack. Karen wasn't home, which suited me fine. I gathered my belongings, clothes, some paperwork. I didn't waste time lingering over the accumulated junk of our years together. There was a note from Karen on the counter. "We'll talk when you're ready. K." I crumpled it up and tossed it in the trash without a second thought. The conversation was over. I'd made sure of that. There was no more Karen, no more pretending, no more lies. I packed up my life, closed the door, and left without looking back. As I walked away, the only thought in my mind was that I was finally free.